that damage would be very far-reaching. And this is going to hurt the average American. They just don't feel it right now.
Their policy is not successful in the first place. So why you are trying to repeat in a very different time, different position with the same failed policy?
The US economy today represents no more than about 13% of global imports. The rest of the world, with 87%, has a substantial stake in ensuring the development and continual enhancement of multilateral trading environment.
The Chat Lounge. Chat Lounge.
Chat Lounge.
The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Welcome to the Chat Lounge. I'm Qiang. With me to comb through the price Americans have to pay due to the U.S.-launched tariff war are Dr. Liang, Professor of Economics, Willamette University in the United States, Dr. Warwick Powell, an adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology, Australia, and Dr. Qiang, a fellow at the Belt and Road Research Center at Minzu University of China. Thank you all for coming to the chat. A warm welcome. So, the International Monetary Fund has warned that America's unpredictable tariff policy and countermeasures by its trading partners will likely deal a heavy blow to the global economy, with U.S. prosperity hit particularly hard. And over 100 economic scholars, including 2 Nobel laureates, have signed a letter opposing the U.S. government's protectionist tariff policy. They're warning the policy, quote-unquote, will impose extraordinary costs on Americans from all walks of life. So let's first check the visible impact. Dr. Liang, let me begin with you. You're living in the state of Oregon, which, according to the latest report, has joined over 10 other states in suing the Trump administration over its tariff policy. So has the tariff policy affected your daily life or work so far? And how has the state of Oregon been affected?
Well, good to be with you. So I think at this point, we haven't visibly seen a lot of the increases in prices just yet. Because a lot of these retailers or sellers, they still have some inventory. But I think very soon we're likely to see that impact. As a matter of fact, I think according to some of my colleagues who just recently purchased some used cars, they reported that the price has visibly risen. And it's very clear that even if right now, as I said, there are some inventories, so people are not going to immediately feel the need to increase price. But a lot of the sellers will go ahead and raise the price anyway because they can take advantage of this perception that because the tariff price is going to rise. And I think so many people argue, tariff is not going to cause the price to rise very much, or if it does so, it's going to be just a one-time price increase. I would really back the difference because I think we have just experienced in the United States a seller inflation. Many of the suppliers having the monopoly power, have the pricing power, take advantage of the disruption in supply chain and cost increase during the pandemic. And they take advantage of that and basically raise prices and propagate the increase in cost by adding, rising profit margins onto that rising cost. So that could easily translate into higher prices and continuous price increases. So I think it's definitely very likely that the inflation rate is going to rise in the US due to this massive sweeping tariffs, especially on China. So not only the consumer prices will, take a hit right away, but also because many of the imports from the United States consist of, intermediate goods, machineries. So you're very likely to see cost of production will rise. And so that would translate into higher prices as well. So the IMF basically now forecasted the US inflation rate will increase to 3% this year, almost 1 percentage point higher than their January forecast as a result of the tariff. So I think things are not looking very rosy as far as the consumers are concerned, but there are also many other impacts. I just recently talked to an Oregonian reporter for the local newspapers. And so they're all worried about this, especially for some smaller businesses as well as some of the farmers, because Oregon states, it's actually the 5th largest state that rely on trade with the rest of the world. And they do trade heavily with Asian economies, China, Japan, and others. So they're very worried about, how this tariff is going to affect their businesses. The governor of Oregon State actually had recently invited some of the industry leaders and businesses to both have a survey, but also have some roundtable discussions just to gauge a little bit of the impacts and to, take some measures to help.
Then what about other states? Do you have any idea? Would Oregon be the most affected one?
Well, I think California, right, would be definitely a big one that would take the hit because it's very much externally oriented. They do a lot of trade, especially in the tech sectors. They also, on top of the tariff impact, they also rely a lot on, international talents, right, immigrant workers. Even earlier, Governor Newsom was saying that California state should have their own negotiation with countries, right, instead of following the federal government's lead, which basically antagonize all the trading partners. So it's very interesting to see, like you said, many states are not in agreement, right, with Donald Trump's policies, and they're trying to find ways to help their own local economies, but also take some measures to counterbalance, right, counteract this kinds of very erratic, very wrong-headed federal policies.
Indeed. Zooming out to the national economy, which sectors have begun to feel the pinch, less than a month since the tariff policy took effect? Dr. Liang, tell us the most striking issue in your observation.
Well, I think, again, given the widespread, the very sweeping nature of this tariff, but also the way it's rolled out, right, very on and off like a yo-yo. Every day there's a different sort of a policy. It's on, it's off, it's sectoral, it's exempted, it's paused. I just think that this will have very wide-ranging effect on all sectors. But so far, you can see the agriculture sector is going to take a hit because China was a large agricultural buyer, right, importer from the United States. And so now that is at stake. The manufacturing sector is definitely going to take a hard hit. I think there has been various estimates about even if the Trump's policy can create some manufacturing jobs, it's going to be devastating for many of the service-based jobs, right, which is the main source of employment for the U.S. economy, as a matter of fact. The aerospace is having a hard hit right now because China has been returning some of the Boeing airplane orders. Automotive industries, Stellantis, just temporarily laid off 800 employees because of the supply chain disruptions, made mostly because of the tariffs with Canada and Mexico. So tourism, I think it's another industry that we have seen, I think, a 12% reduction in international travels into the United States in March. And so that, again, is a significant impact because the tourism sector is actually a large employer, right? It actually employs about, 15 million workers, which it's very ironic when you think about, with all the tariffs, Trump is trying to boost manufacturing jobs. But the manufacturing sector only employs about 12.9 million of American workers, whereas the tourism industry employed 15 million. But with Trump's all these very anti-globalist, basically anti-all countries, right, policies, it really damaged the U.S.'s reputation, its image. So that it's hurting its tourism industry. So I think, none of these policies, it's helping any of the industries, I would say, at this point, not in the short term and not likely in the medium long term either. So so I think overall, these policies are really self-inflicted, chaos and self-inflicted economic ills, I said, in the U.S. economy.
Right. I think the tourism sector is quite interesting. When asked whether some foreign tourists to the States, they're scared by some stories. President Trump replied that America treats tourists quite well. And so to Dr. Powell, I think quite interestingly, I just read about some story about Australian tourists. They usually, during the Easter holiday, they usually go overseas to spend their holiday like the States. But this year, I think a lot of Australians choose to stay actually within Australia. Is the tariff policy or the tariff war launched by the U.S. a big reason behind that?
Look, I think that there's some broader reasons, and they go to growing concerns around safety as far as travellers are concerned, visiting the United States, as well as numerous stories now appearing in the news related to the search and customs experience that many travellers are now having to go through. So the news in Australia is awash with stories of travellers having their phones taken off them, having their bodies searched, and ultimately creating a very poor travel experience. And let's face it, the world is a big place, and the world has many fantastic places to go and visit. Many of them, of course, have been the United States. But if the overall travel experience is poor, then travellers or intending travellers will end up going elsewhere. And I think that that's certainly proving to be the case, not just with Australians, I might add. I don't think Australians are alone in terms of their reluctance now to travel to North America. Indeed. We're seeing data from Europe, which shows that there has been a significant drop-off in travel intentions and travel behaviour. And again, not just in the last couple of months, but over quite a number of months in the lead up to this second Trump administration.
Then apart from tourism, is there any other, issue or sector that's most striking in your observation when it comes to the negative impact on the U.S. economy?
Yeah, look, education's an obvious one too. The education sector has been a significant earner for the United States economy. And there's a broad raft of services, so education and tourism are the obvious ones. The one that I think is also interesting, well, there's two actually. One is LNG, and LNG was a sector that, in particular, China was a significant buyer of American LNG, and it has ceased doing so and has transferred its short-term LNG purchases to Canada, and it's also striking additional LNG supply agreements from other parts of the world. So LNG is an obvious one where the trading relationship between China and the United States is affected not just in the short term, but ultimately, I think, propelling or catalysing longer-term risk mitigation measures. The other one is in retailing, and as Professor Liang touched on, the flow-on effects are yet to be fully felt, but I think it's fair to say that when you have the CEOs of some of America's largest retailers, Target, Walmart and the like, making personal and direct representations to the administration about the impact on prices, and more importantly, I think, the impact on availability of goods in the not too distant future. We're looking at an environment where retailing can be seriously disrupted. The other disruption, by the way, on retailing isn't just the immediate impact on availability of goods, in other words, empty shelves, and the short-term impact on pricing, but it's actually the long-term disruption to the supply chain networks that have been built. And we have seen in the last 2 weeks or so a very active campaign by Chinese manufacturers, particularly the OEM manufacturers who've traditionally made things to be sold under other brands, now reaching out to the broader marketplace globally, saying, look, if you're paying $100 for a branded product, be aware that that branded product's been made by us and it comes out of our factory at $20. So you might as well buy direct. So this supply chain reconfiguration that has actually been going on for the best part of the last 5 years is likely to accelerate. And as that accelerates, not only will the challenges of having stocked shelves become more apparent in the United States, but the US retailing sector employs about 16 million people as well. And many of those workers are from your lower income sectors, and they are the ones who tended to support President Trump. So many from his own electoral base are actually at risk of being significantly hurt as a result of these policies.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
And to Dr. Chu, I think the film industry actually is emerging as an unexpected casualty. Why?
I think number one is not because of the tariff war. It's because currently the Hollywood sucks. If you take a look at their movies made in recent years, it's basically all kinds of the sequels, like the Marvel series, DC series, and all kinds of, or the Pixar's. Well, Pixar's doing pretty okay. DreamWorks is pretty okay, but still they're doing so much of the sequels, so the originality has been losing. People are losing the appetite to watch just a one after another movie with the same IP with the same themes. This is the root cause for movie market losing its position. And secondly, yes, about the tariff war, because in America, one of the most important exported service/product is culture service or culture product, and the movie, TV series, and also games are one of the most important products in this aspect. And what we know is that Hollywood is the leading player in this area, and also Netflix is doing very, very good in this area. Just take a look at the fiscal report of the Netflix in the last year. They're doing pretty okay, but that was before the tariff wars going on. I think this will become the major impact towards the whole, culture industry in America. So what we know is that many countries is trying to retaliate on America, try to streamline the import of American cultural products, even though it's online. So a lot of people need to take some VPN to watch the Netflix, and you're going to see that reflecting on their Q2 and Q3 fiscal report. And also China and many other nations, for example, European Union countries, are also talking about they probably should import less of the American movies, because if you import American movies, you're going to pay lots of royalties, and also the share in the ticket box will also be huge. So that means a lot of the capital flow, lots of the money has been flowing out of this market back into U.S. That's something be not very desirable against the current situation, isn't it? So movie or culture industry is really the collateral damage of this foolish policy and a tariff. You stop the people to getting access to the cultural product, but also I think Hollywood really need to work harder to actually have a better position in this whole market.
Anything else that's eye-catching to you?
Well, Professor Powell and Professor Liang had just mentioned about, all kinds of the damages. Well, we'll continue with the topic on the culture industry. People-to-people exchange actually has been really, really hampered because this tariff war, a lot of people mention about the trade, right? Or a lot of people are saying about finance, but actually culture industry can, generally become a victim about all this. For example, overseas studies, overseas students. Right now, if you take a look at the overseas students and their application numbers has been dropping very, very sharply between China and America. But the potential drop, we've been interviewing a lot of the overseas study, agencies, and the application towards the United States has been dropping. But on the contrary, the application, switched to Europe, to UK, to Australia has been rising very, very quickly. So that is, I think, people try to, avert from the potential risks. And also about tourism. Actually, America is a very, very large tourism destination. But right now, according to the data we've been observing, that is, even though it's just called the tariff war towards all kinds of the products, but people, because of the tariff war, people just don't like what American is trying to do. So they get revoked all kinds of a plan of their tourism arrangements. So there are 20% drop from European Union tourists to America. This is just a 1 month. Well, even not 1 month, just about 3 weeks. We have already seen 20% drop of the tourists just from the European Union. And I think the number from China side is not in a statistic yet, but according to our rough calculation, it's a similarly about 30% drop or to 20% of the drop in the tourists from China to America. And I think similar situation are happening in many other countries as well. So I think this is some damage happening to America, very unexpectedly, because America really is a service-oriented economy. So this actually means a lot to America.
Thanks for the specific numbers. Those are the visible influences we've already seen. But what about the hidden damage? Average Americans don't see, but is actually happening. Professor Chu?
Well, about the hidden damage, well, a lot of people probably, for American families, or ordinary families, what they probably don't think is the purchasing power of the US dollar is dropping very, very fast financially. In China, we don't feel it very much because we are trying to stabilize our exchange rate with the US dollar. But US dollar indexes has been dropping lowest to about 98.2. This is probably the lowest in the past 5 years because US dollars index is as strong. Usually it's been going beyond 100, 105, and now it's only 98. And on the contrary, the euros and the Japanese yen is on the ferocious rise. Well, this is actually not a very good sign. It's because in a Euro market, there's always a gap of supply of US dollars, which means the European market, they always need US dollars to support the Euro market liquidities. But right now, even there was a shortage of the US dollar, but US dollar is falling, dropping against the euro. That can mean a very, very large systematic, risks financially is in the bruising. This is very dangerous. And also, the gold price is also on the very ferocious rise just 2 days ago. Well, yesterday it's been dropping, but, 2 days ago, gold prices rising very, very ferocious. And behind that, you're seeing a triple kill. It's basically what we call impossible triangle. The triple kill means the US dollar, US T-bond, and the US stock market together are falling. Because according to the 101 economics, basically you can only see two falling, but always there's another one rising. For example, the stock market is falling, US dollar is falling, but the T-bond of the United States government is always on the rise. And this time, triple kill. But who is on the rise? The gold. So this can also mean a potential perfect storm is in the making. And a lot of people didn't realize how much of the damage is going to be causing towards the long-term American economy, growth. Today, I think the situation has been reversed a little bit, but I don't think this is the end. And this is just a prelude, and we're going to see more of this kind of the triple kill, perfect storm to show up very, very soon in the next 1 year.
You focused on the financial market, but Professor Powell, I think you touched upon this a little bit about the supply chain. Then what's your most concern about the hidden damage that's undergoing right now?
Well, when supply chains change and they lock into new patterns, then many of the old systems that have been put into place, many of which, by the way, are distribution systems in the United States, will ultimately go idle. And the ability for those enterprises to adjust their systems to new realities will be quite challenging. This will also have spatial implications and demographic implications as well. I think that there's a broader issue too, not just in terms of supply chain disruptions, and it goes to the wider reputation of the United States, both at a political level as well as at a financial level. Politically, what we've seen, in effect, is an administration that makes decisions capriciously, driven by whims, and which are largely pernicious in nature. And that leads to a very strong perception, and arguably a reality, that the United States is less dependable as a counterpart today than it's ever been. And this perception is all the more reinforced by the willingness of particularly this administration to step back from playing constructive and responsible roles in a plethora of multilateral institutions. You simply cannot be a meaningful global player on the back of slogans. And the reality of the shallowness and the capriciousness of this administration, I think, is going to leave a very bad taste in the mouth of other countries and their governments for quite some time down the track, which leads to wider questions about the acceptability of the US dollar going forward. As the previous speaker noted, we've had a triple whammy in terms of the global market's rejection of US dollar denominated assets, including the US dollar itself, of course. And the broader question that this raises now is the extent to which the rest of the world will continue to be willing to accept American government-backed IOUs in exchange for real goods and services. The fact of the matter is that this so-called trade deficit, which has been the focal point of this administration's sloganeering and ultimately its emotionally charged political campaigning, represents the willingness of the rest of the world to take American IOUs in exchange for the things that the rest of the world produces. Now, these IOUs won't be very useful if they can't be exchanged for other useful things. And increasingly, the risk is that these IOUs will become less and less useful as time goes by. And that's a possibility at the moment. I'm not saying that it is locked in stone, but when you see Chinese financial regulators and institutions actively now encourage their state-owned enterprises to expand the use of the RMB for trade settlements, I think it's fair to say that there has been an incredible amount of damage done to what is actually a very fragile foundation that underpins the acceptability globally of the American IOU.
Right. I think you share a similar opinion with California Governor Gavin Newsom in that America's reputation has been damaged. In his words, it's permanently damaged. But is it so serious? Is that just a hyperbole or real warning? Or is it just linked to this administration? Once it's the people in the White House has changed for another group of people, things will change. Probably people will regain that confidence in the United States. Professor Liang?
Yes, so I think I agree. I think what the United States, the Trump administration is essentially doing right now is to uproot the current economic, security, financial system, right, at the global level that the United States have been building in the past at least 80 years, if not really from the very beginning of the foundation of the United States. So I think, it's a big change, right? It's pretty much a pivot when it comes to, for example, the U.S. has been boasting itself, right, being sort of this light tower, this shiny city on a hill. And when you look at, what the U.S. has been, quote unquote, lead in the global system when it comes to its military prowess, when it comes to the dollar king, and when it comes to the liberal democratic value, I think all three are undermined by Trump's administration, right? So this is sort of at the global level, you're seeing, the U.S.'s so-called leadership, has been really, I think, shaken. So take military prowess as an example. I mean, domestically, they have pointed people like Hegseth, right? That they just had this sort of the scandal, right? That they had this group chat and they accidentally brought a journalist into the group, and then they revealed a lot of details about the attack in Yemen against the Houthi group. A lot of these military details were basically released to the public, so to speak. And then he didn't bear any consequences of that, and he did it again, right? So I think, this is a very significant, I think, undermining of their own sort of military operation and apparatus. On the other hand, internationally, you hear in the United States going around and push countries to increase their defense spending, military spending, right, including European allies, and now with Japan. They just finished the first round of trade talk. And when Ishida came back to Japan and basically said, well, there are concessions we will make, but there are also concessions that we can't make, right? Which including, for example, basically take away all the protections in their rice production and agriculture industry. This is not something that the Japanese is willing to concede completely, nor are they willing or able to continue to increase their military spending. So when it comes to military prowess, I think Trump's policy, tariff war or otherwise, have been undermining that. Now, the King dollar, I think Dr. Powell has already elaborated, right, with all the concerns about the US dollar weakness. So in just recent days and weeks, we have seen the dollar index gone down, from 1.102 to now actually rise a little bit to 99. But still, that's a quite noticeable decline. Then the Treasury also, right, that it has basically the yield has gone up from, I believe, 4.05% back on that Liberation Day, April the 2nd, to now 4.36. So it's only 31 basis points. But when you think about the 30 trillion US debt, that basically adds to over $111 billion of interest payment. So I think there are a lot of concerns about the usefulness and the safetiness of this US dollar and the US assets. And so I think that it undermines the so-called king dollar, right, the status. And finally, I think, this liberal democratic value, right? I think, again, the Trump administration is basically unveiled that all this is just mirage, all this is just delusional, right? The United States has talking very openly about taking over Greenland and, making countries to make concessions and, the Russian-Ukraine war in a very hasty and completely unsensible way. So I think just a lot of these damages is being done by the Trump administration. And I also just want to add one last point about the sort of invisible damage, or I would say some of these are not invisible. They just take some time to be manifested. And I think that has to do with the technological innovation, the innovability, right, in the US economy, which I think is really now a very, very important, almost the only, I would say, a big sort of pillar for the US economy. But this idea of banning chips, right, semiconductor chip sales to China, tightened that ban. For example, even the H200 by NVIDIA used to be green-lighted to be exported to China, and now the Trump administration are setting some barriers to that. And this leads to, Jason Huang basically said this is going to cost the company, $5.5 billion. And I think the damage here is that when you insulate the country from foreign competition, when you also put a barricade to tap into the foreign market to raise revenues to fund your R&D, I think all of this will undercut the technological innovation in the United States. That damage would be very far-reaching, and it's going to be very difficult to reverse, and it's going to be long-term. And this is going to hurt the average American. They just don't feel it right now, just yet.
You've been listening to the Chat Lounge. Check out some possible gains the U.S. may get from the tariffs and whether they are real gains when we return.
Sideline Story brings you all things sports related. The hottest topics, latest events, juiciest stories, all with a very personal take. Subscribe to Sideline Story Podcast for heated sports discussions covering events that are happening in China and around the world.
Welcome back to the Chat Lounge. We continue our chat on the price Americans have to pay due to the U.S.-launched tariff war. And Professor Chu, do you also believe this damage is irreversible, especially when it comes to U.S. reputation or its global influence?
I think this question can be answered, in the short term and also in the long term. In the short term, yes, I fully agree that this kind of damage is very lethal. A nation needs dozens of years of the history and also the accumulated performances to mount on all kinds of the credibilities and also the power of its currency, international influences. It takes time, resources, people's determination, leadership to achieve what they have already been achieving right now. But if you want to damage and destroy everything, you probably only need just one foolish leader and 3 or 5 years, and you can get the job done. So I don't think it's been worth it for American people. Actually, they don't deserve it. In the long term, it's very hard to say that because I think America is not always going on a very smooth way. They haven't been experienced a lot of the bumpy road in history as well. And I think the Monroes and also isolationists and also the nationalists also been appearing in America as well. And also they, used to take some very foolish policies like probation, like closing up their market and raising tariff to about 80% and above levels, for example, in President Hoover's period of time. And they've been causing really strong damage towards American economy, reputation, credibility, and also global presence. But I believe America is a country that sometimes they will find a way to recover from their old mistakes. I'm not saying in the future they're still going to do the same thing, but I think there is a possibility that they still can, revert the whole story and also make America truly great again to make this country a respectable country. And as a Chinese, I sincerely wish they can do that if they can, find a way to peacefully coexist with other nations. America being great is not a problem for the other nation, but the only problem is that are you going to be great at the cost of other nation? That would be a problem. If that's going to be the problem, and I think, a lot of people, a lot of country in the whole world, would be a problem to make you not great again. So I think we're going to take a look at the whole consideration or observation from a very, very long perspective. So finger crossed that we still pray for the best for our very important trading and economic partners.
Till then, we'll have another session. But it seems that it's not all about damage or losses, right? I think the Trump administration also has some gains. Japan has expressed a willingness to increase U.S. rice and soybean imports. I think Australia also has reached some agreement with the U.S. there. So, Professor Powell, should that be viewed as a win for Washington as well?
Well, in the scheme of the American trade deficit writ large, these so-called wins are drops in the ocean. And that, of course, is if you take seriously the complaints and concerns about the trade deficit. So I think it's important to keep these things in context. The other thing is that typically in commodity markets, there will be swings and roundabouts. So as the US loses access to one market and that market gets filled by someone else, then US products will find a place somewhere else within the global market environment. Now, that's an interesting observation because what that tells us is that the ability of the US to achieve these sorts of outcomes is a consequence of there being a robust and functional open multilateral trading environment whereby trade diversion and sending products from one market to a different market, if you lose access to one, you can go to another, is made possible because there are actually long-standing practices of open multilateral trade. Now, this current administration doesn't think much of those institutions, but of course it needs those institutions to enable it to make the kinds of adjustments that it's trying to make at the moment. I think that there's another issue too, though. And again, I'll just go back to this question of reputation. Reputations, of course, are hard won but easily lost. And there is never, ever the ability to go back to the status quo ante. You can't just wind the clock back and pretend nothing has happened. And so whilst the United States can and most likely will be able to develop and rebuild its relationships and standing in the rest of the world, particularly as lessons are learned institutionally out of this current episode, the rest of the world will have also moved on. And it will have moved on by developing new relationships, by consolidating other relationships that may have been fragile. It will also move on because the rest of the world, I think, is now more aware than it has ever been aware of until now that the global economy is more than the United States economy. The US economy today represents no more than about 13% of global imports. It is not the be-all and end-all of the global economy. The rest of the world, with 87%, has a substantial stake in ensuring the development and continual enhancement of multilateral trading environment. So that's where I think the real issues are. It's that not only do we have a short-term impact on American reputation, but that in fact, put all of that aside, and the fact that the US can modify some of its trading relations and get the odd win here and there, it's actually the longer-term fundamental changes that are unfolding in the structure of the international political economy.
Right. Actually, to demolish a mansion takes probably just 1 second, and to build one takes a longer time. Back to the gains. Some believe the Trump administration is using the economic pain caused by tariffs to pressure the Federal Reserve into cutting interest rates to ease the debt crisis. Some analysts actually expect Fed Chair Jeremy Powell to give in and cut interest rates by mid-year when several Treasury bonds are due. Otherwise, the U.S. government will face a debt default, which could have severe economic consequences. So do you expect the Fed to succumb to the pressure? If yes, is that also a win for the Trump administration, Professor Powell?
Look, I don't know whether the Fed will lower interest rates or not, but I don't think it's got anything to do with the American federal government defaulting. It's not going to default on a debt that is denominated in a currency that it issues. So that's a non-issue. This issue of interest rates, however, has other implications. And of course, it goes to the buying power of the United States dollar. And should interest rates come down, what that's also aligned with is a reduced buying power globally of the US dollar. At one level, you would say that in theory, if you subscribe to some of the mainstream theories about reduced interest rates spurring investment activity and such like in the domestic economy, that might have some catalytic effect, though I doubt it. But what it's also going to do is reduce the buying power of American enterprises who, if they were intent on embarking on reindustrialization and investing in fixed capital and expanding their productive capacity domestically, they're going to need to import capital goods from other parts of the world. They're going to need to import intermediate input factors from other parts of the world. So whichever way you look at it, the United States economy, by virtue of its structure and its highly financialized nature, is always going to need, at least in the short term, to engage in substantial imports, either as end consumer products or intermediate products into its existing production systems, or if it seeks to expand its productive capacity, it's going to need to import capital machinery. And if it's not going to import it from China, then it's going to have to import it from Germany or Japan or the Republic of Korea, which are actually higher cost options. So reduced interest rates may, in theory, reduce the cost of borrowings. That may contribute to some investment activity in the United States. But ultimately, if that investment activity is to augment productive capacity, they're going to need to import more goods anyway. And if your buying power is reduced, those goods are going to become more expensive.
Right. Professor Liang, what's your take here?
Well, first of all, I think going back to your original question, whether or not Powell will cut rates by mid-year, I think that really depends, right? The Fed has been pretty open about it. They are data dependent. So if the tariff war, among other Trump's policies, damage the economy, so much so that the economy slows down significantly or even at the risk of recession, which we know the IMF puts the probability at 40%, then of course, Powell will have to lower the rate to stimulate the economy. But on the other hand, if the tariff trigger inflation higher than the tolerance of the Fed, then they won't lower the interest rate and could keep the interest rate as it is or even raise it, right? Because that is what they believe. Interest rate needs to be hiked to fight inflation, even though the theory itself is unsound, but that's what they operate based on. So I think if by the mid-year, if Powell does go ahead and cut rate, I don't think it's necessarily a concession made to Trump, but rather could be just the economy requires a reset of the Fed's policy. Now, if that really helps the economy or not, again, I think that it's unknown. I think we tend to overstate the effectiveness of monetary policy. I think, right, at this current high level of interest rate, cutting it may be helpful. But I think if the structural issues of the United States are not being resolved, so in other words, these tariff policies and other necessary policies like fiscal expansion or infrastructure construction and so on and so forth, if these structural problems are not resolved by effective policies, then I don't think cutting rates is going to do a great deal to help the economy. Not to mention, I do agree that interest rate has an impact on exchange rates, but there are so many other factors that have an impact on exchange rate, especially given, again, the very sweeping, very unpredictable policies that Trump administration would roll out that would really shape the expectations of the market by the minute, by the hours. So I think the direction of the travel of the dollar would be, I would say, very unpredictable at this point, especially when you think about if the timeline is a short term, medium term, or long term. So just to say that even if the rates are cut, it may not do a good deal to revive the U.S. economy. And I also want to go back to what Professor Qiang mentioned earlier in terms of whether or not the Trump administration can roll back the policy and remedy some of these damages. I think, of course, the sooner they can reverse course, the better it is. But I think time is running out. I think also given the current political landscape, right, when Trump is basically monopolizing not only the executive power, but all the other branches of the division of power, I am just worried whether or not a reverse course will take place, and if that will take place soon enough. I think, again, the damages is not just to the United States or to China for that matter. We have the entire global economy, especially some of the lower income countries that are really struggling when the global trading system is a decline. The WTO has forecasted that this year the trade is going to decline by 0.2% as opposed to grow by 3% as they earlier predicted. What that means is that many countries that are very trade dependent, smaller countries especially, they rely on imports of fuels and medicine and food. These countries will suffer, right, when the global trading system is in such a disrail. And not to mention, I think many countries are suffering from debt crises, and that really requires some immediate actions. But, as we know, the IMF and World Bank are having their spring meeting right now, and yet the attention, the energy are all consumed by this tariff war.
Indeed.
Very little attention is paid to IMF quota reform or replenish some of these concessionary loans and these funds and how to, facilitate debt restructuring. So I think, many of these developing countries are struggling, and they're struggling right now, and lives are being lost, right? I mean, many countries are paying more debt than what they spend on education, healthcare. So in that sense, I think it's irreversible because, these lost life, these lost opportunities are hard to recover in the near future, if ever.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
You're saying it all depends whether it comes in a timely manner, but some people may see some silver lining because U.S. officials, including President Trump himself, have indicated tariffs on China, arguably the most important ones, could drop substantially. But as we speak, it hasn't happened yet. So, Professor Liang, when do you expect that to take place, according to your understanding of the U.S. government, and how reliable is such a statement?
I think this is a really interesting question, right? I think we want to be hopeful, and in these very dark times, we do want to look for a silver lining. But again, I think we need to look at the real actions of Trump, not what he says, because he can say all kinds of things. I do think that he is under the pressure for sure. Not only the Americans are protesting, right? I think 2 weekends in a row, they had these large hands-off protests. Millions of Americans are protesting against Trump's policy. Now, not that the Trump really care about the popular views, but still, I think the stock market, the bonds market, the dollar, and also his billionaire, donors, people like Bill Ackman, and he's very close member of his cabinet, right, Elon Musk, all of them are opposing tariff. Bill Ackman actually described this as a nuclear economic winter as a result of the tariff. And of course, Elon Musk simply used very colorful language to describe Trump's top trade advisor. So anyway, I think Trump he did say that people, feels a little bit yippy, right? I think he does feel the pressure of changing some of his practices, especially with China. Now, I think the context that he said this is, first of all, the stock market was very volatile. And second, his Treasury Secretary, Bessent, basically said the current status quo with the very high tariff rate with China is unsustainable. So I think, Trump took some of this advice and he wanted to back down on his current tariff with China. But he also said something along the lines that, it may take weeks to work out. And actually, Scott Bessent said a real trade deal could take years. And I think last but not least, even if we see some kind of temporary de-escalation of this trade war, Trump being Trump, I think people will still very skeptical, right? Especially from China's perspective, how much Trump is going to demand for the conditionalities to drop this tariff. And for two, whether he will honor the kinds of trade deal that may or may not be made. Just quickly to sort of, again, Trump's track record, right, has not been great. I mean, he was the one who pretty much inked the USMCA with Canada and Mexico. And yet he then completely reneged on the so-called the greatest trade deal he ever made. He imposed tariffs on Mexico and Canada for all kinds of reasons. So I think, there's this credibility issue. Even if tomorrow he's able to strike a deal with China, who knows when he's going to renege and say, oh, maybe I didn't get a good deal. I want to renegotiate. Right. Or, okay, the deal was the deal, but now I have something new that I would like China to honor. So I think there are just a lot of these complications that I don't think a quick resolution can be really reached. So the ultimate deal can be made, but at least we may be able to see some temporary breathing room between the two countries.
Because this is a quite new development. So I want thoughts from our other two guests very quickly. Professor Chu, how hopeful are you?
Not very hopeful, especially in a very soon future. Bessent is, changing his attitude all the time because Trump is capricious all the time. So that's the DC told us. So still the decision, the attitude can be say out loud, but the decision is, far from being made yet in the White House. So this is surely what I know. So, like Professor Liang has just mentioned, yes, we're very conservatively optimistic about making the deal, but it's not going to happen very, very soon. And also another point I'm going to point out is that a lot of people are saying, okay, it's all about Trump, and if Trump is out of the picture and everything will be solved, American will be truly being great again. No, I don't think that's fair. I think Trump is just the result, because we believe the problem of U.S. made or brought about Trump. It's not Trump brought about American problems. It's because American society and economy have some trouble. 19 richest family got more than 1 trillion augment in the money in the past 6 months, other than the rest of the United States families. So this kind of problem actually causing Trump, and then caused all the problem by Trump, not reversely. So even though Trump says, okay, we're going to stop all this kind of fuss, we're going to stop all the kind of the tariff and everything else, still American will have some other probably foolish policies, and also, impact towards the world from some other angles. This is going to be a must. So until America can actually reverse all its problems and can truly be great again, and then we're going to face more and more of the kind of impact, from time to time. I really suggest that our audience read one book. It's called America, Anti-America. It's been written in the 1990s by a very outstanding Chinese leader. I think that was full of wisdom. And just in the 1990s, he already, predicted all this kind of problems going to happen today. So I think, yes, conservatively optimistic.
All right. Professor Powell, from the Australian perspective.
I don't know what the Australian perspective is, other than Australia is a trading nation that depends heavily on the institutions of open multilateral trade to remain in place. And so long as those institutions remain in place and other countries in the world are willing to play along with those rules, then from a trading point of view, I think it's okay. I think the broader issue, again, is, and to me, the question around optimism or pessimism goes to optimistic about what? And we are going to go through a period of significant domestic turmoil in the United States, in large part because its problems today are a consequence of many decades of accumulated action, and it will take quite a long time for those issues to work themselves through the political economy of the United States. In the meantime, the rest of the world actually just needs to move on. So I'm actually quite optimistic about the prospects of the rest of the world moving on. And America can catch up with the rest of the world when it's good and ready, and when it's ready to behave like a normal nation as opposed to a nation that seeks to dictate terms to everyone else. And when it's ready to participate and contribute to the global community as a normal, equal partner, then I'm sure they'll be welcomed with open arms. So I'm optimistic that the rest of the world can move on successfully, leverage the opportunity to enhance existing institutions and devise new ones. And as for the United States and its ability to sort out its own problems, well, time will tell. I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic. I'm just hopeful that the Americans can figure it out at some point or another before they cause too much damage to everyone else.
Indeed. And last question, a little bit maybe a bit philosophical then. I want to answer from each of you. The Trump administration's tariff policy was believed to be inspired by what former U.S. President William McKinley did over 120 years ago. So some people were asking, how can a nation obsessed with past controversial policies hope to lead in the future? So your thoughts on this, maybe Professor Liang?
Well, I think I've talked a lot,
Indeed.
But I think this is a very interesting question. I think times are different. I think McKinley's era is very different than where the United States is today. There's reasons for, maybe protectionism back then to protect some sort of so-called infant industries. At that time, also the federal government is very small compared to what now. So this idea of somehow we can use a tariff to raise revenues to protect our industry, I think even if it worked back then, it's no longer really applicable today when the federal government is not spending 3% of the GDP, it is spending 23% of the GDP. You can never raise enough tariff to fund that. And you can never protect your mature and sunset industries as if you were protecting the infant industry. Also, I think very interestingly, back then, the Republicans were actually pretty clear that the tariffs are paid by Americans. But they say, we're paying for it. We're just, trying to get better job, higher wage jobs. But I don't think the same thing can be said today. I don't think manufacturing jobs are coming back, nor that the average Americans want to work in the factory. So I think, there are very important differences in terms of what may be working in a short period of time in a very specific circumstances back then, and it's not making much sense today. And final last thing that I wanted to say is that I think Trump also, if he, does read McKinley, he does look into history, he should also remember that in 1901, McKinley made this very famous last speech before he got assassinated. And he said, I quote, "The period of exclusiveness is past. The expansion of our trade and commerce is a pressing problem. Commercial wars are unprofitable." Skipping some lines, he said, "Reciprocity treaties are in harmony with the spirit of the times. Measures of retaliation are not." End of the quote. So again, if Trump really wants to imitate McKinley, really wanted to look into history, I think he should look at the history in its fullness and learn the full lesson from the history.
Brilliant. Professor Chu?
So yes, I think your question is great. I agree with Professor Liang. Actually, it reminds me of an old Chinese story, ancient story. It's called Ke Zhou Qiu Jian. It means you lost something on a boat, and then you carved a mark on the rail of the boat, on the shipboard. And then when the ship finally reaches destination, and then you jump into the river where you carve the mark on the board. So everybody knows this is ridiculous because the boat has already moved a very, very long distance along the river, even though you jump on the same position on the shipboard, but basically it's not the same part of the river anymore. So I think this is what happens in American politics and policy making. McKinley or Hoover or any president, you name them, it's a different America, it's a different world. And, you cannot just try to repeat. And plus, their policy is not successful, in the first place. So why you are trying to repeat in a very different time, different position with the same failed policy? So I don't think that's a very wise thing to do. I think the problem that America step into the same trap again and again is because sometimes they failed to combine the short-term benefit with long-term benefits, to coordinate people's urgent yelling with the long-term goods. So that's a problem. So I really suggest our American friends or international audience to read one book. I think that book is called The Governance of China. Its author is President Xi Jinping of China. In his book, he very clearly described how the CPC is working on this relations, how we can, very well balance the long-term and short-term vision, and also how we can answer people's call, but also try to provide a proper guidance towards the long-term development. That's very, very important. So I think vote politics and, public attention decided Trump's short-term actions and responding in the policy. I don't think that's wise, even though it's been, beneficial to himself in the short term, but also it's going to hurt himself and also hurt American long-term benefit as well. And also American credibility is going to be damaged if they're still going to repeat the same reason. So we still hope for the best for American friends and hope this country can get well to its right track. But if they don't solve the problem, if they don't change the behavior, you will probably stumble into the same trap again.
Maybe want to be nostalgic at an appropriate time. And last but not least, Professor Powell, please.
Yeah, look, as you say, nostalgia. Nostalgia is a dead-end road.
Yeah.
It might be useful in electoral politics because it appeals to the emotional dimensions of voters who are experiencing the American nightmare but are yearning for the American dream. But the dream will not happen by reaching back into its history, particularly if it only reaches back into it in a partial way. There is another Chinese saying, which is 事实求是, and America could do with a good dose of reality and an ability to address reality as objectively as possible, rather than through the affective lenses of bygone times. If America is to be able to fulfill the promise of America, which is a vast land with incredible natural resources, a large population, with a legacy of high standards of education, then it is going to need to adjust to the world as it is, as opposed to imagining a world as it may well once have been. And that's really, I think, the lesson of the current moment.
Well said. And on that note, we wrap up our chat for this session. Many thanks to Dr. Warwick Powell, Adjunct Professor at Queensland University of Technology, Dr. Qiang, Fellow of the Belt and Road Research Center at Minzu University of China, and Dr. Liang, Professor of Economics, Willamette University in the United States, for your time and thought-provoking insights. The show is available on all major podcast platforms. Please email us your comments at radio@cgtn.com. I'm Tuyun. Thank you for listening. Join us again next week for more chat at the Chat Lounge. Bye for now.
With a history of 5,000 years, it's no surprise that China has created a fabulous treasury of folk tales.
Once a year, on the 7th day of the 7th month, all the magpies fly up to heaven and form a bridge.
So many amazing worlds to discover.
I want a new palace,
said King Mu of Zhou one day.
Chinese folktales retold for audiences today. Will you marry me?
He asked. And with little hesitation, she said, yes.
5,000 years of amazing Chinese folk tales.
My father must not go to war. Someone must take his place.
You'll find Chinese Folk Tales Season 3, wherever you discover your favourite podcasts.